Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here in Silicon Valley at 11th Cloud Expo. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening if you're following this out there on the World Wide Web via SYS-CON TV. We have the last general session of the day before we release you onto the biggest Cloud Expo floor that we have ever put together. So just to build up the tension, best practices, as you can see, and APIs are our left, front, and center in this session. Alistair, let's give it up for the CTO of SOA Software. Please, sir, 30 gorgeous minutes of API enlightenment.
Thank you. As I was introduced, my name is Alistair Farquharson. I'm the CTO of SOA Software. I'm going to be talking a little bit about APIs, what they are, how to manage them, how to release them into the wild. APIs are certainly not new, but they are a new phenomenon. And what I mean by that is we've started to see a real explosive growth in the number of APIs that are out there. As an enterprise who's looking at expanding their channels for their business, an API is certainly a valid option. If you look at the number of APIs that are out there on programmable web, for example, there's probably about 6,000 of them. And this represents an incredible exponential growth in the number of APIs that are being made public by organizations. We are approached on a daily basis by companies, traditional companies, brick and mortar companies, that are looking to follow up their website strategy with an API strategy to allow people to build mobile applications on top of the business logic and assets that they have internally, and to expand the channels that they have, the sales channels that they have, and by inference, make more money. APIs are definitely an effect, not a cause. So I'm not coming to you and saying that if you expose an API, you will make a lot of money. What I'm saying is that there is a need for APIs out there. APIs didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because of mobile devices, of B2B partnerships, of bring your own device initiatives. All of these things are driving the need for more APIs, better APIs, and a focus on APIs within the enterprise. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So what do APIs do? Well, they embed or extend your brand. And the most common example of that is potentially the Facebook like button. People are putting that Facebook like button on everything. And you can, as an organization or an enterprise, find additional channels or way to embed your offerings and extend your presence and your brand into other sites, into other media, and onto other devices by exposing an API. An API also enables new channels and devices. And this allows you to reach partners, which you probably do today, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It allows you to reach a whole new generation of application developers that are building mobile apps and are looking for APIs to make their apps more interesting and to create and to become creative around the apps that they are producing. And the third channel or device that you're looking at is your employees. A lot of organizations, including government, are trying to figure out how they can handle all of these mobile devices that the employees bring to work every single day. They're looking at creating apps that the employees can install onto those devices, or even allowing the employees to build their own apps on those devices. And this all requires an API. The third thing an API really does for you is it creates stickiness for your products and services. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So the first example I came up with was extending your brand. So as you can see, there's lots of like buttons, there's lots of social plugins, there's lots of different ways in which you can surface your brand in other mediums and other devices. The second example I gave was to accelerate new channels. And I'm going to walk you through a bit of a history lesson to explain exactly what I mean here. So in the beginning, early 1990s, companies started, or before that, companies reached their customers by telephone, by snail mail, by the yellow pages, by advertising. It was a very traditional mechanism for getting to your customers. And then along came the grand interweb, and companies started to build websites. So they invested in websites, and these websites were initially just marketing websites. They were just content, static HTML. And then along came e-commerce. And those companies that didn't make that transformation, many of them don't exist today. You were forced to make that transformation. You were forced to embrace this new technology as an effective channel for your business. And if you didn't, you were really missing out. And I really see APIs as being something very, very akin to the websites of the early, mid, and late 90s. If you don't invest in APIs, if you don't look at APIs as a potential channel for your business, you're potentially missing out on a great opportunity for your organization. So then along came cell phones and mobile devices. And the most obvious solution that everyone came up with was to put this barnacle on the side of their website and create a lightweight version of their website that would actually work inside this mobile device. And as you know, they're awful. They're still out there today, and they just don't have a very good presence or usability factor. So then what happened was devices matured. We have the iPhone, we have the Android, we have other devices that can support native applications. So people started building native applications to provide a rich experience online. And people build applications that are quite fundamentally different from the way their website works. And in some ways, it's easier to use some people's mobile applications than to go to their website. I know for a lot of things that I do with my airline, I would rather use my mobile app. It gives me a lot more features and functions. It's a lot more well thought of. It's a lot simpler than navigating through their website and pages and pages and pages of content. So companies started building these new applications. And the premise around an API is if building your own application helps you reach your own consumers, what if you could create a developer community building their own applications, hundreds or even thousands of applications that essentially reaches consumers in ways that you hadn't dreamed of? So the idea here is that you create an API, and that's where your responsibility ends, to some extent. I'll talk about that. But your responsibility ends with this API. You make it a product, you publish it, you market it, you bring it to bear, and other people, in their own time, using their own resources, build their own apps that they have to maintain to actually expose your business functionality to the outside world. So as an enterprise, you're looking at this, and this is essentially work for free. It would take you a lot of resources and development resources to build these applications yourself, where there's a group of people out there who just want to build applications and make their own money. Certainly, you may not make the same amount of money, but it's a great deal easier, and it's far more scalable as an organization. So the premise is that building the enterprise website reached 20% of the market for 80% of your total development investment. What we're proposing is that building an API reaches that remaining 80% for just 20% of the cost. So in essence, APIs equals more apps, more developers, more partners, and of course more business through this concept of federation and the building of applications. So the third point is all about creating stickiness. And this is all about the dilution of brand, which you see today. Companies and users, customers, aren't particularly loyal anymore. It's too easy. The barrier to entry or the barrier to change is too low. It's very, very easy for somebody to go to a different hotel website or go to an aggregator and try and get a better rate or try and get a better deal. They can quite easily go from a Marriott to a Starwood hotel without even really, doing a great deal themselves. So the barrier has been lowered between these different businesses that are competing for ultimately the same resources. So if you can expose a set of APIs, what you're basically doing is that you're making it easier for people to aggregate or to expose your functionality into their websites. So the example over here is you've got 3 different businesses. They're exposing their functionality through TripIt, and they're basically building a dependency between TripIt and their backend system. They're getting out of the direct sale, but they're still booking rooms, booking cars, and booking airplanes. So just in review, APIs help you extend and embed your brand. You need to use a well-defined API to control the rendering of your syndicated and shared content, and I'll talk about API development in a moment. APIs also enable new channels and new devices, and APIs also create stickiness for your products and services that you bring to bear. This is a classic one from South Park. How do you actually make it happen? You collect the underpants, then what, before you can make a profit? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the API management platform, or the API platform. But before that, let me just talk briefly about best practices. So firstly, you need to build the right API. Your API needs to be a product. And what I mean by that is you need to think of your API in the same way as you think of your website. It has to be branded, it has to be marketed, it has to have business value, it needs to be supported, it needs to be maintained, and it really needs to be built to meet a business need. You need to build it the right way. In other words, you can't just slap together an API. You have a very discerning group of developers out there or group of partners. If you put together the wrong API in the wrong way, it's not going to work on the appropriate device, and the security is not going to work, and it's not going to be reliable. So you really need to think about how you're going to build this. And the way that I try and state this is you need to build it from the outside in. With SOA, we always say you build from the top down, and that meant one thing. But I think building from the outside in is more reflective of the fact that you're exposing a product to the outside world, and you need to take into consideration the needs of this external consumer. You then need to run it successfully. So you need to protect it, secure it, manage it, and measure it. And I'll talk about how this can be done as well. And then you need to share it as aggressively as you can. You need to publish it, you need to support it, you need to syndicate it, you need to search engine optimize it, you need to get it out there in front of people, in front of developers, and make sure that they use it. And the way that you can do this is by building an API platform internally. Or externally. I'll get to that as well. So if you look at the enterprise API platform, if you think about your customers' needs and the apps that are going to meet those needs, and then the APIs that are going to support those apps, you come up with some idea of what your API should look like. And then you turn around and you look at all of the back-end systems that you have within your organization. You look at the BPM platforms you have, the existing and new services that you have. You look at the databases and enterprise management systems and identity systems that you have internally, and there's this huge gap between the two. You need to build an API, and you've got all this stuff at the back. What do you actually put in the middle? How do you actually put this thing together to make a coherent and effective API, and how do you then bring it to market, and how do you support it? So I'm going to walk you through that. So first of all, you need to actually expose the API, which means you need to build something. There are 100 of technologies out there to build APIs. And it's largely a decision based on two key factors. The number, type, and the abilities of your development organization. So if you have a huge number of Java developers, you're probably going to build it on a Java platform. And then you need to look at the presence and complexity of all the back-end services and data sources that you have. And then you make a decision on what that platform should be. So if you're looking at a Kix COBOL application on the back end with a big IBM stack, you may look at using IBM and building capabilities atop the IBM stack to expose your RESTful API. That might be what it looks like. I'm also suggesting here that this is a potential opportunity for doing mashups. I think mashups was a solution looking for a problem in some respects. And this, I believe, is one of the problems that mashups can actually quite successfully meet. I think it's easier or greatly simplified if, as well, all of your back-end systems are SOA web services. So if you have a service-oriented architecture on the back end, it is that much easier than to take those internal services, which are probably too granular, probably too technical, compose them in some way, and expose your API. But I'm not here to tell you how to expose an API in a technical way. I'm going to talk about some other things as well. So the second thing you need in your platform is a sandbox. And a sandbox is a test platform. Developers are going to come to your site and they're going to try and start building an application. And you need a way of actually supporting that test initiative. If you are a financial institution or you handle sensitive data, then you better put together some test APIs that aren't going to share sensitive information or transfer money in places you don't want it to be transferred. So your sandbox really needs to be built with an awareness of what you're trying to achieve as a business and what your developers are doing. So if your developers are transferring money from one bank account to another, you better build a sandbox with a dummy application on top that shows you how much money is in bank account A and how much money is in bank account B, and then the developer tests their little application and you see $5 went from here to there. If you do that with real money, you could get into real trouble. So the sandbox is a critical part of what this application platform could be or should be. The other thing the sandbox does for you is helps you with app verification. So you could actually lay out what the different scenarios are that a developer has to actually pass using their application before you will actually certify them and give them access to the production endpoints. So a sandbox is actually could be quite a complex thing to consider inside your organization. It needs to be built, it needs to be managed, it needs to be QA'd, and it needs to be kept in sync with your real production endpoints and APIs. Oh. Wrong button. So the second thing is your developer portal. So you're going to produce this API, and you can't just expose it out onto the endpoint. You actually have to create a site, a portal, a developer.yourcompany.com, where developers can actually come and find out everything they need to know about your API. It's the focal point for your API initiative. It needs to describe succinctly the value of your API. It needs to host all the technical and legal documentation. It needs to support the developers in their efforts, and it needs to provide lifecycle and workflow for the applications and APIs that you're putting out there. So you need to support sign-up, you need to support provisioning, you need to support security, you need to support monitoring, management, reporting, all of these things within this developer community. The analogy I like to draw is very similar to the open source community, where developers would come, they would look at an open source library, they would read everything they want to know about it, they would download it, and if they found a problem, they would stick that exception or error back into the search box, and they would get some help. That's the kind of experience that developers are expecting, and the kind of experience you have to deliver as an organization if you're exposing an API. So this is the website for your API. The next thing you have to think about is, what are all the non-functional requirements? Ideally, you want to focus on building an API and bringing value to your business and bringing money in the front door. What you don't want to sit and worry about all day is how you're going to secure it, how you're going to provide OAuth, how you're going to monitor traffic, how you're going to manage quality of service, how you're going to do caching. All of these things are non-functional requirements that basically are very essential, but they are a distraction to building the API. You need to focus on all the functional requirements and make sure you get the API out there, that you market it, that you promote it, that you figure out all the legal ramifications of publishing an API. You don't really want to worry about the security and management of that API. Then last but not least, you also have to think about the life cycle. A lot of people tend to think, because APIs is a new kind of technology, that they can build it in isolation of everything else. But the fact of the matter is that APIs talk to other things and they interact with other systems. So it needs to interact with your SDLC processes that you have inside your organization. You need to understand what the dependencies are between the API and any of the back-end systems, and you need to have visibility into how those things are performing relative to each other. If you don't understand the relationships and you don't integrate the life cycle, then your API is going to be a barnacle that's just stuck on the outside of your organization, and you're really not going to get the performance out of that asset that you expect. So the API platform is something that you could build and deploy internally. It's something that you can buy from a vendor such as ourselves and deploy internally. It's also something that vendors like ourselves will offer to you as a service. So you can pick and choose which components you want and which ones you need to build internally and which ones you can leverage from other providers to best accelerate your time to market and lower your costs. So let's talk a little bit about the products that we have and how they sort of fit in. So if you look at the life cycle at the top of the chart, we have plan, build, run, and share. That's kind of how I've encapsulated the life cycle. I know it's crude, it's not agile, it's not RUP, I don't know what it is. But first you need to plan the service appropriately. You need to figure out what service you need to build in the first place. And this is something that enterprise architects, business analysts, your center of excellence for SOA and APIs, these people need to sit down and figure out, what is your API going to do? And what should it look like? And that's something that's done in conjunction with a portfolio management product like ours, or another tool that you might have internally. Secondly, you need to build the service appropriately, and you need to control so many things about an API that you wouldn't have to control with a typical SOA style service. And what I mean by that is, an API has so many additional things about it because it's a product. If you're bringing a product to market, you need to figure out how is it going to be branded, how is it going to be supported, how are you actually going to document it, and what are the legal ramifications of releasing this API. When we talk to our customers, honestly, building the API is almost nothing compared to the hassles that go into writing the documentation, serving up the documentation, and figuring out the legal agreements that need to be signed for that API. A lot of people internal to a business are very concerned about APIs. They don't understand APIs. You have to sit down and explain an API and a mobile app to a lawyer, and that takes months. So it's a very, very painful part of the process, but it's something that you need to go through, and it's something I hope will speed up over the course of time. So anyway, you need to manage the life cycle of these APIs, and you need to manage the life cycle of these APIs in relation to the life cycle of the other projects that are going on within your organization. So you need to have some kind of life cycle management tool or build management tool, or maybe that's the wrong term, but you need to have an understanding of what your dependencies are from a life cycle perspective and how you're actually managing the development of that API and all of its related artifacts. You don't want to get to the point where you have your API, you're just about to go live, and the legal guy says, what are you doing? You don't want to get into that situation because that's a really unpleasant place to be. Then, of course, you need to actually run the API appropriately. You need to manage policy management, and these are policies that encapsulate things like quality of service management, compliance, throttling, caching, security, authentication, authorization. There's different ways to do security. You can use OAuth, you can use headers, you can use a hope and a prayer. There's lots of different ways to do security, and that is provided by whatever infrastructure you install. And it's usually, or best described, using some kind of a policy-based mechanism. So depending on the kind of API and where you're exposing it and who is using it, you're going to have different kinds of policies and plans and, what's the word I was looking for? Policies and plans around the usage of the API. This also helps you monetize the API. So you could take an API and you could say, for 100 transactions per second, it's free. But then up to 1,000 transactions per second, I'm going to charge you $5 a month. From 1,000 to 10,000, I'm going to charge you $100 a month, and so on and so forth. So you need some way of actually defining these plans. You need some way of collecting all the metrics. You need some way of analyzing these things and determining what the outcome is if you exceed one of these plans. So some organizations go for something very simple. They don't monetize the API directly. Others do monetize the API directly. It's kind of like a cell phone. If you go over your plan, they all charge you an exorbitant amount of money. So it really depends on the kind of API and the kind of the business that you're in as to what kinds of policies and plans you put into place. Then there's the API management and service management capabilities. These are the things that are literally intercepting the message at runtime and caching it, securing it, routing it, transforming it at runtime. So the API management capabilities will be doing things like transforming from JSON to SOAP potentially, or from JSON to XML. It would be routing your request across a global network. It would be ensuring that the OAuth tokens are valid. All of these kinds of things are done by that runtime infrastructure. It's also going to collect the monitoring data and the metrics that you need to be able to provide feedback to the developers in the first place, and of course to provide feedback into your own auditing and billing systems if needs be. The fourth part of the puzzle is the community, which is the developer portal that I mentioned. So this is how do you actually share the APIs once you put it out there. And this is quite a complex problem to solve because it's not just static content. It has to do things like issue application IDs to developers so that they can embed those in their applications. It needs to manage the onboarding of developers themselves. It needs to provide some kind of forums and communities where these developers can collaborate. It needs to manage the life cycle of the app and how the app connects to an API. It needs to provide visibility for yourselves as API owners to see who's using that 3-year-old version of an API. And it give you the ability then to actually connect to the human being that built that application and say, you know, you need to really get a move on and transition to the new API. So the community needs to provide the marketing channel for your API as well as the support for the API that you put out there. And that's all I have. Thank you very much. I'm Alistair Farquharson, the CTO of SOA Software. If you have any questions, I guess you can come see me afterwards. Or now.
They can ask you right now, after they've
Thank you.
applauded. Now, of course, the competition between the opening of the bar and the questions is another
I know.
matter. But
It's a challenge.
Here's a teetotaler.
Nonsense. Utter bullshit. So I was curious whether or not offering the API platform as a PaaS lets you do things like shared DDoS protection so that you can detect attacks on one of your API customers and apply that across your entire portfolio.
So if somebody does a denial of service for a particular application against one endpoint, can you then apply that then to all the other endpoints?
Right.
Is that what you mean? It depends on the configuration. The short answer is maybe. You can, dependent on the actual deployment of the infrastructure and whether or not it's dedicated or platform as a service.
Right.
The capability is there, but it's not commonly used. Okay. Normally, we apply denial of service policy at the API level or the relationship between the API and the app level. So we will do denial of service at that level. Also, things like SQL injection, antivirus, all of those kinds of things are typically not distributed globally.
Right.
If the actions.
Related thing. I mean, I know that I used to work at Amazon and Yahoo. All the major web players maintain with the FBI, global blacklists and all sorts of other information. It would be nice if you could use your platform as a single point of control for applying that kind of blacklist policy.
Right. Blacklists are slightly different from denial of service. If you experience a denial of service on one endpoint, you may be happy. But a blacklist is something else. A blacklist is something that is system-wide. So we can put in blacklists, source IPs, net masks, etc. across the entire system. Any other questions? The bar is competing heavily.
Here comes what I'm guessing could be the last question before that.
He's probably going to ask if the bar's open.
Well, there's no doubt the bar is open. No, the question is, do you have these slides will be available later?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, we will make them available.
Excellent.
There's a lovely video.
I'll explain to you how offline. Yes, plus it's on.
Excellent.
Let's give it up for Alistair Farquharson.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.